The song that we just sung was written by an artist called Melody Green. I'm going to read to you the lyrics again. Jesus, my Redeemer, name above all names, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, oh, for sinners slain. Thank you, O my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done. When I stand in glory, I will see his face, and there I'll serve my King forever in that holy place. She wrote that song in 1977, and her husband, Keith Green, popularized it. She received the sad phone call in 1982 that her husband had died in an airplane crash. It's one of those things you don't understand. Here's someone in the prime of their life, well-known Christian artist. But that last bit of lyrics I read to you. When I stand in glory, I will see his face, and there I'll serve my King forever in that holy place. So Keith Green is doing that very thing today. And you know, as you get older, you begin thinking about what kind of legacy you're going to leave. What are you leaving after you're gone? I don't mean how much you're leaving for your kids, and the inheritance. That's a worthwhile question to think about as you spend time and money on stuff of life. What are you leaving? Well, this morning, we, as Neil already explained, we are beginning our 40 days of discipleship. 40 days is roughly between now and Easter. And 40 days of discipleship is across the board in all of our languages, all of our age groups. We're challenging everyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus Christ, considers West Park to be their church home, to raise the bar of their commitment to discipleship, raise the bar in their intentionality and the effort they give to discipleship. And we created this tool that Neil explained to you. You want to pull that out, 40 days of discipleship. I want to cover it one more time to give you one last chance to step up to say, Charles, I'm in. My spiritual temperature is important enough to me. I want to raise it, and I'm committing to this 40 days. On the screen here is a picture of the whole thing. You notice there are 4 quadrants. The next one gives the first quadrant, which is prayer. The next one is the next quadrant, which is scriptural engagement, Bible engagement. The only difference here is the second box, attend the 40 days in the Word class. We're waiting until after Easter for this class. The third box is serving. The fourth box is just kind of other. And if you're willing to say, Charles, I'm in, I want to take that challenge, what you do is that little tear off there, you initial it, you tear it off, and after the service, just come right over here, drop it in the basket. We probably have almost 250 people committed at this point. We'd love to see 500. That's really kind of our goal, to see 500 people say, Charles, I'm in. I'm going to lift my commitment to the intentionality I give to my own personal spiritual development. So I hope you'll do that. Hope you'll sign up also for our prayer chain. Well, we continue our series this morning called Believe, how to think and act and be like Jesus. And we're looking at 10 core practices that helps us do that very thing, to be more like Jesus in attitude and action. Today we're looking at this. The big idea is on the screen. Total surrender. I dedicate my life to God's purposes. And I believe when we are in that mode of total surrender, there'll be 4 choices that we'll make on a regular basis that we're going to see this morning. Now, I want you to think about something. You don't have to answer out loud. But when somebody says, I'm all in, whether it's to a sports team or to an event or to a movement or to somebody else, when somebody says, I'm all in, what do they mean? You don't have to answer out loud. Just kind of answer it in your own mind. What do they mean? I'm all in. With that in mind, if someone is half in or partially in, what does that mean? Well, I want to lay out a couple of imaginary scenarios. Let's say you're invited to a wedding. You know how it works. You sit out there, pastor's up front, and the bride and the groom are there, and they're saying these vows to each other. And so some point in that ceremony, the pastor will say something like, will you, to the groom, make this commitment, these vows, will you keep these vows to your bride till death do you part? Now imagine this happened. When he asked that question, here's a groom, and his response is, let me think, okay. Now, would that be kind of odd? What about this? You're a coach of a 10-year-old boys hockey team. It's the third game of the season. And one little boy shows up. He's only got one skate. You're the coach. You say, what's the deal? Why do you only have one skate? And he says to you as a coach, well, I'm only 50% into hockey today. That would be odd. What about this? You kids are at the table. Your mom, makes a dinner for you. Maybe she's the cook around the house, and you're sitting down, and she throws a half-cooked hamburger that's still bleeding on your plate. You say, Mom, what's the deal? She says, I was only 10% into cooking today. That's kind of silly, isn't it? But that is a picture of what it means to not be all in. Marriage is not half in. Cooking is not 30% in. Being on a team is not partially in. Now, I think this little scenario begs the question. Maybe you know where I'm going. How would you answer this question? How much am I in to my faith? How would I honestly answer, what is the percentage that I am into following Jesus Christ? We would say, 10%, that's not good. 25%, no, 50%, that's better, but that's still not good. 60%, that's getting better. 75%, that's pretty good. What? 90%, that's real good. You know what Jesus asked us for? 100%. Here's what he said in his words in Matthew 16. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now, in today's culture, the cross is primarily a piece of jewelry, and we talk about it at church or around Easter time. Much more significant in those days. If someone were to commit a crime, it was considered a capital offense, and they were going to be executed by crucifixion, which was a horrible way to die. Here's what would happen. They would have to carry the crossbeam of the cross up to the place of crucifixion. This is what Jesus did. So as this person is walking through town, the soldiers are behind this person that's going to be executed. People are looking on and saying, he's definitely all in. He's not coming back. And so what Jesus was doing was kind of capturing this well-understood idea of carrying a cross and saying, hey, I expect you, if you're a follower of me, you to be all in, not partially in. So what does being all in look like? What is this whole thing of full surrender, total surrender? What does it really look like? Well, we're going to look at one of the most beautiful stories in all the Bible this morning of three boys called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and a fiery furnace. Now, let me give you kind of a backstory here. In ancient days, when one nation would overtake another nation, what the winning nation would do, the winning army would do, they would look for the very best young men. The handsome, the ones that looked physically, really strong, the one that would look to be intellectually really sharp. They would take those young men. They wouldn't kill them. They'd take those young men, bring them back to their country, and over the next period of time, they would infuse into them their culture, their beliefs, their worldview. And if they passed muster after that period of time, they would be conscripted into the military or into government service. That's kind of how things work. This is what happened here in biblical days. 500 years before Jesus, the book of Daniel was written, and it tells, as the book of Daniel starts out, King Nebuchadnezzar, which he wasn't a very good king at all, he conquered Jerusalem. He'd done this very thing, looked for the best young men, brought them back, and among those 4 young men were 4 that we often refer to as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were 15 to 20, somewhere in that category there. And their original names were around the name of the Hebrew God. When a nation would capture these young men, they would change their names to indicate a new destiny and a new ownership. And so they changed their names. But usually when we refer, Daniel was the original name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the new names. We just, for some reason, we say those 4 names, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So it begins in Daniel 1, verse 6. He says, among these, that is those who were captured, the really sharp-looking young men, among those were some from Judah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those were the original names. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar. We usually don't refer to his name as Belshazzar because that's a long name there, but Daniel. To Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. So here we have this story. Daniel's not in this particular part of Daniel, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are. So in chapter 2 in Daniel, the king had a dream. The king's court astrologers could not interpret the dream. Daniel did. And out of appreciation to Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar gave him great responsibility, put him responsible over large areas. And Daniel asked, can my three friends also have responsibility? So Nebuchadnezzar gave them special responsibility too. The astrologers didn't like that. These were Hebrews, these were foreigners, and they got responsibilities that the actual astrologers, they really wanted. So we'll see later how that came to bear. Well, if you want to follow along, I'm starting in Daniel 3, page 627 in the Bibles there in your chair. So Daniel 3:1 says this, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This is a little video clip of an artist's rendering of what this statue might have been like, including the base, which had to be huge, and the statue. It would have been as tall as a 7-story building. This is huge, huge statue, and as it kind of comes in here, you can kind of get the perspective how it would tower over the rest of the city. Now, this plain of Dura, we're not exactly sure where that was. Was it close to Babylon? Was it in the outskirts? So we're not exactly sure on that. So what happened next was he made this big statue. What happened next was he issued this order for all the leaders to come to this plain of Dura where this statue was. So there are hundreds of these leaders standing in front of the statue wondering, what are we here for? Why did we come for this? Then a herald proclaimed why they came. Verse 4 says, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear, and basically he describes all these various instruments, this orchestra, as soon as you hear this orchestra playing, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Now, these leaders now understand, after this herald proclaims why they're there, oh, I see why we're here. We're supposed to bow down, and in doing so, we're pledging our allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar because they came from surrounding areas around Babylon. So, next, the herald announces the penalty. If you don't bow down, here's what's going to happen. Verse 6. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So you got the picture here on this plain of Dura, this big statue, hundreds of leaders around it. This herald says you're supposed to bow down, which signifies you're now committing to a Nebuchadnezzar as his supreme one. So you got that situation. Then you have not only the leaders as they're before this, then they understand that when this music plays, they're supposed to bow down. Now, they see the statue here. Over to it, one side or the other, the scholars say they probably could see this oven or this kiln that was used, that was built to be able to forge the blocks and the bricks for the foundation, also to melt the ore so they would have the gold. So here they are. They're seeing the statue. They are looking at this kiln. And they're realizing, if I don't bow down, that's where I'm going to end up. So that's the setting. That it says in verse 7, as soon as they heard the sound of this orchestra, hundreds of these leaders bowed down, except for 3. Now, Daniel's not in this part of the story, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are, except for 3. Now, I don't imagine, this is my conjecture, that these astrologers, as all these people gather, they look for those 3, and they kind of, a few rows back, just see what these guys were going to do. So the music played, everybody bowed down, but these 3 did not. So these astrologers were tattletales. Went to King Nebuchadnezzar. Hey, let me see what we saw. Remember the edict you said? Bow down, they're going to be thrown into the furnace. Well, 3 did not, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That made Nebuchadnezzar mad. He asked these 3 guys to come. And now think about it. Let's step back a little bit. These 3 guys, they realize, okay, there's the statue. We believe in the one true God. There's a statue. There's the kiln. What would a little curtsy would be fine. Or we could bow down on the outside, but on the inside we're standing up. We don't want to offend anybody. After all, God would forgive us. They didn't do that. They stood where all could see. Well, when they were tattled on, Nebuchadnezzar got angry, called them before him, and said, hey, what's going on? Why are you doing this? They explained, we're not going to bow down to you. He even gave them another opportunity because he appreciated these guys because they were Daniel's friends and they probably served him well. He gave them an opportunity to, you can bow down now. We'll play the music. You can bow down now. And they said, no, our allegiance is to God, not to you. And verse 16 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So to understand again, these guys had followed the king's edict, come to the plain of Dura. They probably faithfully served him. And now when this herald said, this is what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to bow down, and in bowing down, you're pledging allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar versus your other gods, they drew a line in the sand. They drew a line in the sand and said, no, now we'll follow the king, we'll support him, we'll serve him, but this line in the sand, we're not going to cross this line in the sand. This is as far as we will go. We will not compromise. In other words, they were all in. They saw the statue. They saw the kiln. They heard the herald. They knew that's where they were going to end up. But they drew a line in the sand and said, no, we're not crossing that line. They were all in. We choose to be burned before we're going to compromise our commitment to the one true God. So this kind of begs the question, do you have a line in the sand? Is there a line in the sand you have drawn, or is your line kind of like flexible, depending on the circumstances, depending on the cost? Like, well, I'll draw a line in the sand if it doesn't cost too much. If it costs too much, I'm gonna move that line over to here. But if it costs too much still, I'm gonna move that line over here. So I got a lot of wiggle room in here. No wiggle room for these guys. They drew a line in the sand. Goes on to say, and then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. That means as hot as they could get it. And they threw in the ore and whatever it was, charcoal to heat it up. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. This was overkill. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. You see, the reason the king had them keep all their clothes on, because he wanted to make sure no vestige of them survived, that every little scintilla of that represented them was burned up, was nothing left but ash. And in their haste, not exactly sure what happened here, but the soldiers that bound them up and they took them to the furnace, they ended up getting killed by the heat. So they were thrown into this fiery furnace. And this furnace, I didn't say this, sometimes when you preach your sermons, you're not sure if you repeat yourself. Did I tell you kind of how the furnace was shaped? Okay, good. That was just first service. Great. I used to do 4 services at a previous church. And by the 3rd service, you thought, did I just say that? Anyway, so this furnace was shaped like the old kind of glass milk bottles. So at the top was like the chimney, and midway was where they would put in the ore to smelt down, and the bottom was where they put in the charcoal and the wood to heat it up. So that was what it was like. So King Nebuchadnezzar is peering into one of those openings there from a distance because he wanted to make sure they got their deserved punishment. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? He double-checked with his advisors, is this right? And they replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. He was witnessing a miracle, and he couldn't make any sense out of it. The flames had burned off their ropes. They were walking around in this furnace, and there was a 4th person in there. Then it says, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. He wanted to get a better look at what's really going on here so they could hear him, so he got closer. And when he says the Most High God, he was essentially saying of all the pantheon, of all the different gods, they were a polytheistic culture, your God, we're going to put him at the top now. They came out, the leaders surrounded these three boys. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. No physical harm, no burning of their clothing, not even a hair singed. And if you camp, you know, and you're around a campfire, what do you smell like after camping? Like fire. Didn't even smell like fire. Then he says, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their very lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. He was so moved that he then issued an edict that anyone who spoke against the Hebrew God would be in big trouble, and he gave him a job promotion. It really moved Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember at the beginning of the message, I said this total surrender idea, I think it's reflected in 4 choices that we need to make. So let me give you those 4 choices that we can see in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's choice number 1. We don't defend what is right. We don't have to defend what is right. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually said almost those exact words to King Nebuchadnezzar. They said, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. In other words, they were so committed to the one God, they were so in that they made the right choice and they didn't have to defend it. They didn't even try to defend themselves because they knew what they were doing was right. If you go into the book of Exodus, and when Pharaoh had the Hebrew people under his thumb, and God was continuing to use Moses to work all these miracles, all these plagues, and Pharaoh's heart kept getting cold. Finally, he said, okay, let the people go. They left. He changed his mind, sent the army after them. In that context, there's a beautiful promise written in the book of Exodus. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. So what this says to me is when you're all in, 100% committed to Jesus, you do what is right, you don't have to defend yourselves because God's going to fight for you. He's going to be your advocate. So if you're all in, you don't feel like you have to defend doing what is right. Here's number 2. We willingly pay the price to do what is right. We willingly pay the price to do what is right. Now, understand that they did not have the book of Daniel. We know what's going to happen. So it's really easy to say, hey, just throw us in the fire because we're going to get rescued. Yeah, no big deal. They didn't know the outcome. They didn't have it. And unfortunately, sometimes in our Christian life, it's like, yeah, I'll stand for Christ if I'm assured that I'm going to come out on the other end in a better place. That my choice of doing what is right, it's going to benefit me. They saw the fiery furnace. They felt the heat. But they were willing to pay whatever price it took, including their own lives. You know, it's been said that everybody has a price. There's a price at which you would give up your most treasured beliefs, values, convictions. In this case, we're talking about integrity and fidelity to God. That is that we have this price that as long as the circumstances don't dictate there's going to be a great loss here, or as long as the circumstances don't dictate that there's going to be a great price to pay, I'm okay. But I am willing to pay a price if it's high enough. Hope you don't have a price. Here's the third choice. We trust that God will deliver us for doing what is right. We trust that God will deliver us for doing right. Now, I need to explain this a bit. I'm going to go back to what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to Nebuchadnezzar. Said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Now that sounds like, well, they had this full confidence. They're going to come out, no singed hair, no smell. But here's what they said next, though. A little qualifying word, 3-letter word, but, B-U-T. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. What they were saying is this: God is all powerful. He can do anything he wants. He can rescue us where we don't even smell like fire. Yet because we don't know God's will, we're just trusting him whatever the outcome may be. Nevertheless, we are going to trust the God that we serve. We go into the book of Job. If you read the story about Job, Job was wealthy, had a great family, things are going well, and almost in one fell swoop, he lost everything. And yet there's a beautiful verse that tells the condition of his heart. He says, though he slay me, though God take away everything, yet will I hope in him. Jesus even understood that sometimes we don't understand God's will. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane about to be arrested and crucified, he says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. That is this whole thing I'm going to face, this dying for humanity and taking upon their sins. Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Now here's the point. Sometimes by doing right, and we see this fire ahead of us, God will remove the fire or just take us away from it. He rescues us from it. And that's kind of like what we always want to see happen, right? We want that to happen. Sometimes he will support us through the fire. He doesn't take the fire away. He doesn't take us away from the fire. He supports us through the fire. And sometimes we don't make it through the fire because Christians die. They die of sickness. They die of shocking things. They die because of persecution for their faith around the world today. China, India, Russia, Nigeria just recently. Islamic countries, Christians are being persecuted more than ever in the history of mankind. I'm not making this up. I'm not being inflammatory. These are the facts. All around the world, Christians are dying for their faith. They are going into the fire, and they don't come out unsinged. They come out in the presence of Jesus. So, sometimes God does deliver us from the fire. Sometimes he supports us through it. And sometimes he welcomes us because we didn't physically survive it. Apostle Paul, if anybody would be walking with God, it'd be the Apostle Paul, right? Wrote much of the New Testament. Well, there's something... some fire that the Apostle Paul was facing. We don't know what it was. It may have been a physical ailment. He called his thorn in the flesh. And it says he prayed 3 times for God to remove it. Now, praying 3 times is not like praying 3 times in 5 minutes. God, will you please remove this? That's number 1. God, would you please remove this? Number 2. God, would you please remove this? Number 3. It wasn't like this. The idea is this deep intercessory prayer over 3 intense times. God, would you remove it? Would you take it from me? And God says, no. But here's what I will do. The promise to you and to me is my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That was God's promise to Paul. He said, I'm not going to take you from it, but I'm going to give you the grace you need to be able to stand in the very midst of that. And I think of Psalm 2, Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of what? Death. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had the confidence that God could do whatever he wanted to do. He could rescue them in the best case scenario like it happened. They didn't know that. That wasn't the key thing. They did not know God's will, yet they were trusting him even in the uncertainties. So we trust that God will deliver us, and deliverance looks different in different circumstances. Here's number 4. We rest in his personal presence as we do what is right. We rest in his personal presence as we do what is right. Jesus says, I'll never leave you, never forsake you. Remember Nebuchadnezzar when he was looking into that fire furnace and he jumped up from his seat and he looked and he said, I see 4. You know who I believe that 4th person was? Many scholars believe that who it was? It's Jesus, the pre-incarnate Jesus. Jesus had shown up. He was right there protecting those boys from getting burned up in that fire. So, are you facing a trial today? Now, probably all of us have trials, and a trial is on a spectrum, from an inconvenience to like, this is life and death. And so we're probably all somewhere along that. I hope this story can remind us that we don't have to compromise. We should not give in. We should not give up. Jesus was there for those who need him, and he is there for us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by their example, show us that we don't have a price for compromise. We don't have to have a price for compromise. We don't think that we're not going to make it through because God's grace says, I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to give you the grace you need. So, I'm going to circle back to where I started. How all in are you? let's say that, we're all great. 10%, that's not really good. 25%, that's not much better. 50% better, but really not. But 75%, is anybody comfortable here with 75% or 80, 90, 95%? It's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show us. It's all in is 100%. That's what Jesus said. All in is 100%. Last week I shared with you kind of our financial challenge in our church, and I challenged you in two ways. I said, number one, will you take seriously your personal development, and will you, over the next 40 days, raise the bar? I hope you'll do that. Looks different for everybody. I understand that. I hope you take that little tear off initial and say, Charles, I'm in. My personal spiritual growth means enough to me that I'm going to invest at a new level so that I can love Jesus more. And the second piece was we called the church to prayer and fasting. Pick 30 minutes or an hour and praying. Say, God, would you show up in a powerful way? We had our elder and our staff retreat this weekend. And one of the things that rose to the top that we feel like we have to address next year, we don't know how we're going to do that yet, but it's a tremendous need, is we need to raise the spiritual temperature here at West Park. That I think we can get so comfortable. God's doing cool stuff, it's a great facility, great programs, all this stuff. We can just get comfortable in that. So I'm praying that what God's going to do over the next 18 months is so move in our hearts, so stir us, so convict us that we're not going to settle. We're not going to settle for even 95%. But we're going to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No, king, we're not going to compromise. We're all in. 100% all in. Would you bow your heads? Father, thank you for this incredible, wonderful story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were all in. What a powerful example to us. Even though our issues aren't necessarily life and death, but so often we can just keep moving the line in the sand further and further out if it costs too much. Let us not be like that. Help us to learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And by your Spirit, help us, Lord, to be all in. I pray for West Parkers that this church will be known as a church that's all in for Jesus, no matter the consequence, no matter the cost, that we are all in, fully in, 100% in. And Lord, I pray that it would start with me. That you'd show me how to consistently, more consistently, live a life that says, I'm all in. I pray this in your name. Amen.